Welcome to Breaking Down Bergman. I'm David Friend.
And I'm Sonia Strimban.
And we are looking at Passion of Anna.
Kan du ta reda på någonting till du kommer hem ikväll? Andreas satte in någon pengar i Basel när pojken blev född. Jag skulle behöva de pengarna nu. Ja. Ja. Gjorde han aldrig det? Varför det då? Du skulle ju hjälpa honom. Vi har talat om de pengarna. Jag förstår inte. Elis, det är ingen vanlig förrättningstransaktion vi talar om. Det betyder faktiskt någonting för mig detta. Och det är inte pengarna. Elis. Ja. Ja. Vi ses ikväll. Jag tog reda på vad samtalet kostar.
Oj, tack, det var väl ingen brådska. Välkommen åter. Det går bra att använda telefonen där som helst.
This film was in production as the relationship between Ingmar Bergman and Liv Ullmann was breaking down, sort of the last gasps, if we want to call it that. And I think you can sort of see the shaking foundation sort of on the screen in some respects.
It's a very disconnected film. I think there's more elements of his kind of forced, heavy-handed deconstruction in this film than we've seen in even some of the earlier ones. And it's both in a technical fashion as well as in the way that he interrupts the plot and the storyline.
Yeah, I think that that's what is so interesting about Passion of Anna, is that what makes it so unique is Bergman's deconstruction of film as it is presented, but it's also the downfall of this film.
I think the deconstruction in this film actually almost gets a little bit away from Bergman, which is not something we've seen in the recent past, so it's a little bit surprising. So you have the plot, which mainly revolves around four characters. Two couples, four separate people, but two couples that come together, and then they kind of swap a little bit in between there, as often happens in a Bergman movie through infidelity, and then they separate once again. And while the plot revolves around those four people and their lives and the power dynamics in those relationships, you have all these strange external events that seem really disconnected, even at a metaphorical or thematic level, from what's actually happening in the relationships with these people. So for example, you have these weird acts of animal cruelty that are happening throughout the film. Or another example is the strange linkage between Passion of Anna and the movie Shame, and the kind of awkward, misplaced dream sequence. So it becomes really difficult to piece the movie together and try to come to some kind of conclusion about what it all means, or what he's trying to do, or how it fits into overall, like in a trilogy sequence or even in the decade.
And I think that's what's so interesting about Passion, is that it is really part of a trilogy. And I don't think this is discussed quite as much as the God and Man discussion that comes up. Bergman never officially made that a trilogy, but it's always framed as being one. I think that starting with Hour of the Wolf, moving on to Shame, and then this film as well, all sort of encapsulate this Liv Ullmann period in Bergman's career, where we saw Max von Sydow and her relationship played out on screen in different ways. This one, with the questions of truth, I just found it particularly interesting because of how it may have reflected Bergman's relationship with Ullmann, which was falling apart, as I mentioned, on the screen. Here he presents Andreas, a broken man, someone whose relationship has crumbled, and now he's living isolated from the world, and by chance he encounters Anna, who is also a broken woman, both emotionally, as we learn, and also physically, because she has this crutch. And when Andreas meets her and she comes to use his phone, we don't know much about her, and there's this mystery that he encounters that isn't really clear to anyone, him or us.
And as he starts to look for truth and uncover certain things that are mysteries in the film, we are uncovering them with him as the viewer. So for example, the character of Anna, who, as you said, is mysterious, there's a lot of factors that are unknown about her. She seems a little bit vulnerable, she seems a little bit needy. She's definitely still beautiful, even though she's, hurt in some way. And I think that triggers interest in him, compassion, maybe a desire to protect her, but definitely a desire to know more about her. So when she leaves the purse behind at his house after having to use his phone, he snoops through it and he opens a letter and reads a letter, because I think there's a real curiosity in him to get to the bottom of things and really to know without any degrees of doubt about why certain things are happening or not happening, or who people really are. One of the things that makes it challenging for the most part, I think, is because as Andreas is trying to get to know Anna, you would assume that he would learn things about her that would shed more light into her personality, into her past, into what type of person she is, her beliefs. But in reality, what we get is the opposite, because the more he learns about her, the more suspicious she becomes. She's someone who comes across, well, verbally, she proclaims to be very adamant about truth and being completely honest and revealing things even if they're painful, and that's how people really get to know each other. Whereas in reality, we know that all those things are completely untrue, and the way that she represents herself in her previous relationship, those are all falsehoods. So the longer her and Andreas spend time together and the more deeply they become involved together in a relationship, the more deceitful she actually is to him. So it's very interesting to see how Bergman covers and uncovers and shudders and reveals things, but unlike in other movies where it actually all leads to something, in this film, it just didn't quite get there for me.
Ellis is one of the more interesting characters because he literally represents this truth-telling. Bergman has him as a photographer, as sort of the documenter of truth. But what's interesting is that even though he has walls of categorized photographs, they're not really organized in any way. They seem to be. They're all labeled properly, but the labels don't really mean anything, and he doesn't really seem to have any idea of where anything lies. So, I mean, it's a very obvious, literal way for Bergman to translate that into the film, but, I mean, it felt like it was stretching at times.
I think he actually meant for it to appear like it was documenting and capturing truths, but he wasn't able to articulate it clearly enough in the film. When I saw that scene of his workshop, it seemed like through the dialogue and the tension that was there, because Andreas and Eva at that point were already having their affairs and it implied that Ellis knew. It seemed like through that interview and the photography session, he was really going to bring him to some point of truth, that it was going to be cathartic in a way, like that tension in the relationship was really going to reach that height. And then it just kind of fell flat because Eva walked in, there were these petty little exchanges amongst them, and then it all kind of fizzled out and nothing really came of it.
What really threw me off about all of these complexities is how Bergman presented it. He's made this decision, this conscious choice, to return to presenting the film as a film. And in that, I think he's gone further than he ever did before by literally inserting little segments that allow each actor to discuss their character. So it really pulls you out of the film and reminds you, yes, you're watching a constructed reality. But the interviews didn't really offer anything that was all that revealing about the characters, about the actors. It just seemed like a gimmick in a way. If Bergman was to have gimmicks, which I feel he usually doesn't, this would be a Bergman gimmick.
I think one of the reasons that we struggle so much with analyzing this film, and even watching it to an extent, is because I think Bergman himself was struggling at the time, as a director, as an artist, and as a person, to come to a conclusion of whether for him film was an element of pure honesty and expression, or whether film was actually a deception and, as you said, a constructed reality that was actually preventing him from maybe knowing the truth about his own self. So we see this in periods of his life where there is a lot of turmoil. He becomes unsure.
Though, sometimes we talk about how the turmoil in his life brings out these films that are essentially his masterpieces. But I think that this film had so much turmoil behind it. I mean, he admitted that this was basically an idea on paper that wasn't properly scripted. The dinner sequence, for example, it was an improvisation mostly. So, I mean, he didn't really have a plan going into this, and I think it looks that way. He creates a film that, it does make sense as a whole, mostly, but it doesn't have the structure of a proper storyline. And to say that that was entirely intentional, I don't believe that. I don't think that Bergman really knew what he was doing as this film was being made in all the ways that you would expect him to as a professional director.
You know, I actually liked some of the natural elements in the film. The dinner sequence was lighthearted. I thought the dialogue flowed. One of my preferred scenes in the film was actually when B.B. Anderson's character, Ava, was seducing Andreas when she came over to his house and she did this little song and dance number quietly. I thought that was really real, you know? If it was a woman with a man, especially a woman like Ava's character who's really insecure and unsure of herself and constantly playing the victim, that's how a seduction scene would really go. I found some of those lapses in directorial vision from Bergman actually gave his actors more presence in the film.
Yeah, and I think if we are to talk about what works in this film, the actors' performances are one of the most memorable moments. In fact, the entire climactic sequence in the vehicle between Liv and Max is pretty intense.
Absolutely, and I like the fact that until the very end, we never really know if that is the truth behind her non-truth. Like, is this what happened the first time around? Did she kill her husband and her son?
Yeah, it's clever. It's a clever little twist.
Yeah.
But at the same time, some of the little clever moments in this film are what I found most frustrating. For example, L182, which is how the film opens essentially. There isn't a title card, Passion of Anna, or as it was known internationally, A Passion. There is this coding, which doesn't make sense at the time, and I think has baffled a lot of Bergman fans because some have related it to Ellis's categorizing of all of the photo boxes, but technically the L182 doesn't match the coding of the boxes. There's extra letters in there and it just doesn't make sense. So that leads you to believe, okay, what was Bergman doing with this? What is this little tease at the beginning of the film?
I found that coding pretty frustrating too, and I think it undermined the film as a whole. When you open the film with something that, you know, the viewer can consider to be a screenplay code, you're right away signaling that
this is a script.
This is made up, this is constructed, and I think that takes away from the story. And frankly, I found it annoying. Like, at first, yeah, it's intriguing, like, ooh, what does it mean? Is it in Ellis's workshop? But then when you're sending your viewer on this goose chase for clues, it's irrelevant, really. And one of the challenges for me in the film was the fact that I kept waiting for all of the sequences of events to make the characters evolve. And I found them all pretty stunted. Even though they went through some pretty significant events with each other and separately. So, for example, the character of Anna, you would think that as she, you know, draws closer to Andreas, they develop a new relationship, that she would grow from that she would find reinforcement in it, maybe some comfort, maybe she would recognize that it's not a direct parallel from her previous relationship, and that she would be able to be honest with herself. And she seems to have the need to construct these positive, like a positive spin on the way the relationship was. So she's constantly deceiving herself and those around her that her marriage was so perfect and that there was such a level of transparency and honesty between her and her husband that even when he was deceitful to her, when he cheated on her, it actually made them stronger. And so she creates these false stories about the past in order to make it palatable to herself. And later in the film, we find out that it could potentially be from a place of horrific guilt because she's actually the cause of their deaths. But it's not proven, so we don't really know. Instead of Anna coming to grips with the truth and growing from it, she actually reverses back. She goes through this repetitive cycle, and we only get the clues later on. So, for example, we find out later in the movie that her previous husband's name was also Andreas, and the man that she's with now is Andreas. And that she potentially killed her previous husband, Andreas, by speeding in a car and then crashing it, and now towards the end of the film, she's also speeding in the car and potentially crashing with Andreas and destroying him. So, and all the four characters repeat these destructive patterns and never come to grips with the truth of what's wrong with them to begin with.
The strangest thing about Passion of Anna is this sort of subplot, because I don't know what else to call it, of animals throughout the film being massacred, for lack of a better word. They're dying left and right for various reasons. In fact, there's probably someone killing them, but it creates sort of this looming evil that exists in the backdrop of the actual storyline. Anders runs into this puppy at one point that is hanging from a rope, and he saves it. But then later on in the film, a bird hits a window, and at Anders' own hand, he kills it to sort of spare it from the pain and suffering. But that was one part of the film that really took me a while to figure out, and I'm not entirely sure that I got there.
Throughout the film, I kept trying to connect the the background part of the animal cruelty with the foreground, which is what's happening to the people in the film, and see where's this tenuous link. And I never quite got to it. The closest that I could get to it was through the character of Johan, who ends up being falsely accused. He's the villager, and they basically beat him and humiliate him to the point where he takes his own life. And then it later becomes discovered that, of course, he's not the culprit. Somebody else is doing these things, and we never know who it is, but someone is committing these atrocities. And so the brutality of falsehood is the closest that I could come of making a tenuous link between the people characters, particularly Anna herself, who claims truth but is actually a deceiver, versus the vulnerability of someone like Johan, who, because of falsehood, is forced to take his own life and is actually physically and emotionally hurt to the point of death. And the fact that we are, at the very end of the film, it's not revealed to us who the actual murderer is of the animals. We never really find out, and we're always suspecting, is it one of the four main characters that we're trying to relate to, that we're trying to understand, be sympathetic to? We don't come to a sense of closure or a sense of truth, and we're never able to witness. And that open-endedness is worse than anything else.
But it's also interesting that the villager is chosen as the guilty one, and he is punished for the crime. There is some sort of satisfaction in creating this truth.
I think that the beating and the death of Johan, even though he is innocent, goes to show just how desperate we are to be comforted by the fact that there is some kind of truth. The people living in that community could not live another day without having someone to blame with certainty, to say that they are evil and they are guilty, and if we can just punish them, then we will be okay. And Bergman himself doesn't necessarily do a good enough job of subverting that, because at the end of the film, even though as the viewers we know that it wasn't that man, that he's innocent, and we feel a sense of outrage about it, he doesn't give us a sense of closure by either A, revealing who the real murderer is, or B, showing us the remorse of the people that actually drove Johan to commit suicide.
We can only assume that they don't know and that they're satisfied with their so-called truth.
As you mentioned before, the character of Ellis is particularly poignant because he's the one character that, as all this silly drama is going on, he's the only one that's kind of like, yeah, it's happened before, it's happening now, it'll happen again. I know my wife, she goes through these kind of phases. And he's almost like an observer, a voyeur, if you will. And it's like a weird string of events that he has pinned up in his workshop in different frames or boxes. And that's kind of like the metaphor for this whole film. It's a strange sequence of things that may or may not connect. It's awkward. I think he knew it was awkward. He tried to make it somehow artistically elevated by creating these existential or like meta components of actors talking about their own characters and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, it still didn't come together.
So is this essential Bergman for you?
I think it's interesting, but not essential.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. There were some really poignant elements to this film that I think Bergman was really hitting on something that could have made a greater film. Strip out all of the film gimmickry, as I spoke about, and you would have a relatively competent production here that I think would encourage a better discussion between us, a more thought-provoking one at least, rather than one that's interspersed with confusion. That brings us to the end of this episode of Breaking Down Bergman. Be sure to join us next time when we are looking at The Touch.
And don't forget to visit our Facebook page where we have more discussion on the films.
And subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'll see you next time on Breaking Down Bergman.